series. This is Jews, Money, and 2025, the second annual Jews, Money, and series. In what feels like a moment of crisis in our world, the theme of this year's series is metaphorically surviving and building after the crash. One of the key reasons we do political education here at JLF is to help our audience understand the role that philanthropy has played in causing the status quo, in this
Maybe.
case, a moment of crisis in the Jewish community, and to understand the role that a
Here,
reformed philanthropic practice can play in helping us move
tell
forward.
me which cartoon panda, and I'll print it tomorrow. Okay.
Uh, yes, we love cartoon pandas. We love cartoon pandas. Um, yeah, but so in this we're looking to do that in this moment, to grieve, to heal, to dream of, and to take action towards a more just future. So, in this session, we're going to start that whole process by unpacking and coming to a shared understanding of
Well,
the brokenness of this world and the forces that influence it. What does it mean for all of us sharing this planet? What does it mean for the soul of the Jewish people? What role has American Jewish philanthropy played in getting us here? And what role does it play in enforcing the status quo? So I couldn't be more excited for the individuals we've got here to speak on this. Again, if you haven't registered for the whole series, yep, there it is in the chat. Again, please do. Yeah, childcare in the background, that does happen. Please do register for the rest of the events in the series. Would love to continue having you. Um, but I'm going to get out of your way soon and introduce our moderator, Dov Kent, the acting director of Diaspora Alliance. But quickly, before I fully do that, for questions, if you have questions today, do not just post them in the random chat. We don't have the Q&A function on. You see the person who's posted JLF questions and tech there, who was just posting the chat a couple times. Send your questions to JLF questions and send your questions to JLF questions and tech. They'll be compiled and sent to our panelists at the end of the conversation. Love to hear that from you, Sheer. Thank you so much. That first series was also one with the first event we had was with Lila on it. Big, proud moment for me, and love to hear that. Really appreciate it. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and introduce Dov Kent. Um, Dov Kent has 2 decades of experience in grassroots organizing, political education, and movement building. Dov served as the executive director of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice from 2011 until 2017, supporting the organization to triple in size and win game-changing legislative victories for police accountability and workers' rights through powerful local coalitions. Under Dov's tenure, JFREJ grew into one of the strongest and most effective progressive Jewish organizations in the country, creating significant culture shifts within the Jewish community, New York, and nationally. Dove also served as the senior strategy officer at Bend the Arc, a Jewish partnership for justice, organizing Jews across the country against the far right during the 2 years leading up to the Trump defeat in 2020. And she currently serves as the acting director of Diaspora Alliance, an international project that fights anti-Semitism and its political misuse. Dove, the floor is yours.
thank you. Thanks so much, Jordan. And it's really good to be here with all of you. A lot of familiar faces and then also new people. So I'm so glad I can be here. Thanks. And I actually just wanted to start us off by taking a deep breath. You are welcome to join me. Yeah, take another one of those if you want. There is just so much on our hearts right now. I feel like I don't need to tell this group, but we have the rise of authoritarian politics here and around the world, the genocide in Gaza that has a precarious ceasefire in which Palestinians are still being killed, the rise of anti-Semitism and its political misuse in our country and throughout Europe and Latin America, increasing political violence and repression around the world. I mean, this is a time when we need to breathe as deeply as we can. So I'm going to take another deep breath. Again, you're welcome to join me. Um, and it's also a time to remember these are not metaphysical forces. People got us into this mess, and people will get us out of it. And we are some of those people, literally in this room. So we will get to a different moment in time. But to do so, we need a map, a detailed map that shows us how we got here and how we get out of here. And if you're going for a detailed map, then Dania and Lila are your guys. This is great. So a bit about who else is here tonight. So Dania is an organizer and writer examining the lessons from the U.S. labor movement for Jews organizing desperately needed new religious and cultural institutions. Amazing. Her recent essays have appeared in Spectre Journal, Truth Out, Dilettante Army, and in these times, and her poetry in Killing the Buddha. We love our multi-skilled practitioners. And Lila Corwin Berman is the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, where she directs the Goldstein-Goren Center for American Jewish History. And her most recent book, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution, was awarded the 2021 Ellis W. Hawley Prize for the Organization of American Historians and from the Organization of American Historians. And in addition to scholarly articles, she's also written guest columns for the Washington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, MSNBC, Chronicle of Philanthropy. And she has a new book, Who is American? Belonging and the Question of Jewish Citizenship, from Princeton University Press, which will be published next spring. These are phenomenal people that I go to very regularly for thought partnership in just about everything. So very grateful. Um, so to get below the surface, our discussion this evening is going to go in a somewhat unusual order. We're going to do present, past, future. So we're going to ask, where are we today? Institutionally, economically, politically, what is true about the American landscape and the American Jewish landscape that might not be obvious to us and that we need to attune to? And then we're going to go back. How did we get here? And more precisely, what do we need to know about the last 50 or 60 years that give us key information about the moment that we are living in now? And then forward, what are we going to do about it? What is ours to take on at this moment? What interventions can we effectively make under current conditions? And throughout this conversation, we are going to be stitching a thread. And I want to invite you to look for that thread. So you might not know that Dania is also a master knitter. So imagine that Dania and Lila are going to be stitching a tapestry here this evening. And through it, there's going to be a red thread, and it's this, that the institutional landscape that we have in the Jewish community today came from the alliance of Jews and non-Jews. And the power to change these institutions will also come from the alliance of Jews and non-Jews. Okay, so none of what formed our institutional life happens solely from Jews, and nothing that we're going to do to change it is going to come solely from inside our community either. So I'm laying this out now so that as you listen to these brilliant women speak, you can be sure to take in the specifics of this overall point that they're going to be making in a few ways. So now let's get started. Lila and then Dania, let's start in the present and would love for you to talk about what about the institutional landscape, the economy, and the Jewish community is true today that we should all get aligned on, get on the same page and understanding. I know it's a big question. So first thoughts, best thoughts.
Well, I'm really happy to be here having this conversation. I have only done latch hook and not very well, so I worry about being someone who's going to carry a red thread through, but I'm going to do my best. Um, I think that, there's so many apparent forces right now. There's so much news, there's so much devastation, and one has to will oneself not to see it. So there is so much that is palpable and in a sense like obvious. And I think that like undergirding so many of the forces that for me anyway are causing me just such a sense of being dispirited is a really crushing economic situation that is it's not just making it unsustainable for so many people to thrive, but it is, I think, the basis of violence and war and terror. And the way I think about it is there's so many different ways to think about it, so many numbers we could use to illustrate it, but we could think about the fact that in 2024, roughly speaking, our country's expenses were $6.7 trillion, and we collected about $4.9 trillion in revenue, and we borrowed the rest to fill the gap. The amount of money that the wealthiest 1% in our country control is about 47 trillion. So we have a gap that's a little, a bit over, let's say, 1.8 trillion, and we have 1% that is in control of $47 trillion. And the gap that we have is the pretext for saying things like, we can't feed every child who's hungry, or saying things like, we don't have enough money to compensate teachers well, or saying things like, we can't pay people a living wage, or we can't have health care for everyone, and so on and so forth. And it creates the conditions of scarcity. And the conditions of scarcity then justify a politics of repression and oppression. And we live in this moment when we have so many people who are in need of so many different things that our country absolutely could afford, absolutely could give people. We have 750 billionaires in the country. In 1987, we had one, right? So all of these kinds of figures, they can wash over you. But I actually think that we're at a moment when, this is my optimism, that things are so bad that there's an openness among more and more Americans to actually understand that these are not abstract numbers, but these are the conditions of people's lives. And part of that is absolutely manifest in the Jewish institutional world right now. And that same kind of false politics of scarcity, the false sense that there's not enough and that we need to kind of hoard what we have, and not just in terms of material resources, but also kind of identity resources, and that my identity is somehow a property that pits me against you or your identity. All of that is also fueling a kind of sick, I would say, a sick sense of how power operates, and a sense of operating only through this feeling of scarcity and fear and panic. And that's not actually the condition of the world we live in if we so choose to change it.
Mm, mm. Thanks, Lila. Dania, to you, what about the present do we need to get rooted in?
Um, Thank you, Dove. And thank you, JLF. It is an honor to be here and to be here with all of you tonight, and especially to be in conversation with a scholar I admire so much. So what Lila said, and also, I think that what Lila says sort of opens us up to think about how we think the economy works and how the economy actually works. So most Americans, we think we live in a mass consumption economy. Like, imagine a Target, even though I think we're still boycotting Target, but just imagine a Target, right? Many people of different class backgrounds shop at Target for some mix of necessities and splurges. Before we boycotted Target, I have too many plastic purses from that aisle, whatever, right? And most people think that this is how corporations make money, and this is how people earn wages, by making stuff and selling it. And the more people who buy stuff, the more stuff that Target sells, the more the economy grows. This was more or less true, and it is not true anymore. Like, building off the numbers that Lila was just talking about, the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the United States account for just about half of all spending in the entire economy. And so economists call this a K-shaped economy. And I'm getting to what this means for the Jews. Hang in with me.
You always do.
We're all here, wherever we go, here we are. So this, in a K-shaped economy, alongside that, what we have is an intense concentration in many kinds of markets. So the labor market, which is where I have focused my work, the consumer market, and the stock market. All of those like intensely are intense concentrations of power. Like, for example, in the stock market, it's just 7 tech stocks right now that make up a third of the value of the entire stock market. So economists call this a K-shaped economy because the rich and the poor sort of start at a same, or the rich and the rest of us started at one same point and then diverge. And we're pretty far out, as Lila was saying, in the divergence. So thing one to know about this is that an economy like this just cannot support, is totally incompatible with democracy, which is kind of the thing our country learned in the Gilded Age, kind of. Which is when Louis Brandeis said, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. So that is because when power is concentrated this much, we, the people, lose the power to rein in those corporations. And just to say, part of my contribution to the red thread is that we Jews, we are so special and so particular and so unique. And we really are. I really actually genuinely mean that. And also, we're just like everybody else. So everyone has this concentration of power problem, and we really know it, and we know it in our own way. Jonathan Greenblatt and Bill Ackman, for example, do not represent most American Jews, what we want, what we think, or how we vote. In particular, we do not mostly want to dox protesters or deport them, even when we don't agree with them. And we cannot get rid of Jonathan Greenblatt and Bill Ackman as prominent spokespeople for our community because there are no democratic mechanisms to vote them out of office or off our TVs. And the reason that they play this role is because they command quite a lot of resources. And then one more thing I wanted to say about this, which is this kind of economy is the top driver of anti-Semitism. It's connected to the bipartisan fury about Jeffrey Epstein and the recent horrendous revelations in his emails that were just released. It's connected to Israel's war crimes. It's connected to the tech companies. Yes, they monetize a whole ecosystem of misinformation, but more than any other factor, it is the structure of this economy. People need an explanation for why things are so bad and how so few people and so few firms can have so much power and money. And that explanation, the go-to explanation in Western global North culture, is the socialism of fools. It's a small group of secretive, clannish, and ill-intentioned people who secretly control things. It's basically the protocols of the elders of Zion. And so even when conspiracy theories like this are not directed at Jews, it's anti-Semitic. And as we see day in and day out, thanks Nick Fuentes, it's increasingly is about the Jews. So from here, we can go better places. Back to you, Jeff.
Okay. Thanks. There's a phrase of like, we cannot promise to make you feel better, but we can promise to make you feel. Okay, this is the state we're in now. Nobody wants us to be in this place, or at least nobody in this room wants us to be in this place. So let's back up to the past. How did we get here? This K, the two directional lines, they started closer together at some point. So what legal, economic, military, cultural changes happen over these last 50 or 60 years that had such a huge impact on the present, particularly on the economy, and let's start going in here, particularly on Jewish institutional life? And Lila, I'd love for you to start again and then to Dania.
Sure. And Dana, I think what you said was really, really interesting, to reflect on how this particular model of an economy with such wide inequality when it comes to resource distribution is also a vector of anti-Semitism. And it's interesting to think about the kind of period that in the kind of last few years, people have sort of nostalgically called the Golden Age, right? Is this sort of post-World War II period when one of the kind of properties of it was that there was a more equal, it was not entirely equal, but there was a more equal distribution of resources. And although the word socialized state tended not to be used for all sorts of reasons, mainly because of anti-communism and the Cold War, that was functionally kind of what we were moving toward in many ways. And, coming out of World War II, actually, there was, you know, quite a bit of energy around the idea of having state resources that were distributed to a wider swath of Americans, right? Having protections for labor. Obviously, all of these things fell short in many ways and had limitations. But the idea, in fact, of a kind of socialized state, some historians say, was able to kind of take root in the United States precisely because there was such a clear sense that we were not communist, that we were not the Soviet Union. And so, as long as the United States sort of was able to keep saying that, they were able to also at the same time, maybe quietly and maybe without the label of socialism, build up state resources, right? And build up a more equitable distribution of those resources. So you have coming out of World War II, the highest marginal income tax rate that we've ever had. And then you see the steady decline of that, especially near the end of the Cold War, right? You have coming out of World War II lots and lots of federal programs for funding for higher education, for funding for mortgage programs, and for funding for all sorts of other kinds of social programs. Again, many of them limited, especially on the lines of racialized segregation and inequality. But all of that kind of potential that is being built after World War II kind of hits a high mark by the 1960s and early 1970s, and then starts to be pulled apart. And there's all sorts of reasons that it starts to be pulled apart. And one of them, in an ironic way, and in a way that I think historians are trying to still kind of tease out and do work on, is that as the kind of like clear sense that you have a kind of enemy in the Soviet Union, and that's communism, and that's something that is very different from democracy, kind of allowed actually a certain level of experimentation, as long as there's still that sort of mantra to say, as that starts to be pulled apart, and as you get these shifts in the kind of global geopolitics, and as you have a very concerted movement among business people and among different corporations toward more and more deregulation and toward a politics that allows for wealth to build without being distributed. Many of those kinds of features of a more socialized kind of politics start to really fade away, right? And you have, some pretty massive shifts that are kind of most clearly illustrated just in looking at income tax rates, although that's just one kind of measure that you could look at. And, a total pulling back, even as the income tax system might remain progressive, a total pulling back of the commitment to actually close loopholes, right? And this is another way, I think, to sort of see how the energy shifts by the 1970s and 1980s. So there were always in our tax code, it's impossible not to have loopholes, right? Because you can't think of every situation, and there are lots of interests that are trying to work to accumulate and hold as much wealth as possible. But periodically, Congress was very much energized by the fact of closing those loopholes. In fact, that's what people, platforms that people would run on for many, many decades. And you start to see a turn by the late 60s and early 1970s to actually not closing those loopholes and responding to the lobbying of large corporations and business interests that are starting to organize, right? This is like the kind of early days of Koch brother funding and other kinds of lobbying techniques, right? Starting to organize to actually stop Congress from closing loopholes. And so instead of a system that, when there's an opening, then Congress will come in and legislate, or the IRS will kind of shift code to ensure that there's more money flowing back into revenue, you have a system where there's just more and more gaps in the tax code. And you have a system where whatever income people are earning, the wealthiest are not holding their wealth in income. They're holding their wealth in stock, in appreciated property, and in all sorts of other assets that can't even really be valued by any system that we have, right? And so there's a disjuncture, whereas I think in this kind of first couple decades after the end of World War II, there was a sense of the kind of tools that our country had to regulate the economy were aware of the different kinds of wealth that people held. By the 70s, quite consciously, there was an effort so that there's lots of wealth and lots of ways of holding onto assets that are actually not touchable, right? That become invisible to systems that we have of distributing wealth. So the kinds of shifts that then produce the situation that we're in now kind of like are an accretion of all of these things, right? And so the best tool it might seem that we have to distributing assets and power and everything else is still it is still a progressive income tax system that we have, right? But the problem with it is that the very wealthiest people report either no income or very, very low income. So I think I just heard recently that Jeff Bezos was able to claim some kind of child tax credit because his income was so low, right? So when you have systems that allow assets to build that are not visible to these kinds of state systems of redistribution, you get forms of power that are just not regulated through any kind of democratic means. And then those forms of power come to exercise a kind of recursive, so they then become the basis for lobbying for more ways that that kind of power is unregulated, right? And so this kind of spinning of deregulation that starts in the 1970s and really takes off under Reagan in the 1980s, I think is so central for understanding how we're now in this moment when the way our economy works is also pulling toward this kind of analysis of conspiracy and of anti-Semitism because it's inscrutable, because it is by design obfuscatory, because there's no energy to close tax loopholes, right? Because instead of understanding what an estate tax really would be and how worthwhile it would be to pursue one, there were great marketers in the 1980s who called it a death tax and convinced the people who would have not paid it and who would have benefited from it that it was not in their interest, right? So all of this is kind of the kind of historical context that has created the conditions that we're living under now.
Thanks, Lila. Dania, I want to hear from you, and then depending on where you go, Lila, I might want to go back to ask you a little bit more of that then, like, how did that show up in Jewish institutional uh, life and processes? Like, what did that then translate into? But yeah, Dania, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Yeah. So, the historian Judith Stein called the 70s the pivotal decade. And I'm really lately obsessed with the nature of the pivot as it happens in the wider American context, and then how that plays out in the Jewish institutional world. So much of my analysis is informed by Lila's scholarship, so I'm not going to step on that part. But I wanted to say a couple of things about the social and movement context that Lila was just talking about. So there's a lot to say about the Red Scare and McCarthyism but I'm not talking about that right now. We can talk about that later, maybe. But in that kind of golden age of American capitalism or world capitalism, that's roughly from the mid 40s to the mid 70s. There a number of important social things happen. There's the dynamic with the Soviet Union that Lila was talking about. There's the coming out of World War II, where most of the rest of the world is destroyed, either by colonialism or war or both. And so there's an opportunity to rebuild. And Americans make a ton of money rebuilding, like just gangbusters. The economy grows really fast. And because the economy is growing so fast, it creates the illusion of a truce in the class conflict between the people who have wealth and the people who produce wealth. And so that has, and the way that works out in labor, and then I'll talk about how that I think applies to the Jews, is like, so during the Red Scare and after the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, unions expel their members and leaders who are suspected of communist activity, and everyone signs a loyalty oath. And they really dig into this idea of economic nationalism or Buy American. Here, I learned most of this from the historian Dana Frank, whose book Buy American is must read. And what Buy American does is suggest that American corporations are somehow better or more socially valuable than other kinds of corporations. And that that what's good for, say, the Ford Corporation is good for the workers. And the workers will benefit as Ford grows. And that was true in this moment of glorious golden age while the economy was growing. And then in the late 60s, there's a recession, and built into this growth model is a problem, which is as wages and benefits expand, and if social spending doesn't keep up with it to help pay for the cost of living parts that we're also having a problem with in the here and now, paying for rent or housing, right? It creates an inflationary spiral, and the corporate profit rate goes down a little bit, which if your corporation is a crisis, if you're not a corporation, it's not really that big of a crisis, but it is a problem. And so in this challenge of the way that these social forces created a détente is this problem of reduced corporate profits. And the way that we solve that problem is with neoliberalism, which is all the stuff that Lila was just talking about that comes afterwards, and all the stuff I was talking about concentration of power. So what's happening in American society at the same time, right, is like there's a ton of money, you can move, we build a bunch of suburbs, people move to the suburbs, there's a dispersal of population, and the guardrails, the social and political guardrails that kept capitalism regulated begin to be dismantled in this moment in the pivotal decade. And it stresses this liberal compromise that, like, if we have enough economic growth, workers and working people can have enough of a share of that growth that we can improve living standards and everyone can get what they need. So it's just in that moment, right, that we talk about both, I suppose we'll talk about the 1967 war and the kind of mass conversion, as we say, to Zionism, but also like it's in that moment that white Jews really start to become white, like really fully are white. And so alongside all of the stuff that Lila was saying about financial assets, whiteness becomes an asset, and people become really invested in the exclusion that characterizes American life, because what keeps your house appreciating is the exclusion of your neighborhood. And so those kinds of dynamics play out inside Jewish institutions and outside Jewish institutions for American Jews, and our neighbors. So I'm going to pause there, because then I think we're going to talk about what that means for Jewish institutions and Jewish identity.
Yeah, Lila, would love to hand it back to you.
Yeah, that was really interesting, Dania. I want to talk about books with you more. So, I mean, I think that like the way to think about how this then affects Jewish institutions is to continue to kind of pull through these different historical threads. And so the kind of sense of this post-war abundance, for all those reasons that Dania was talking about, that's built itself on forms of destruction and extraction, um, absolutely enriches the institutions of Jewish life, and the kind of ideas of whiteness and the possessive investment in whiteness that American Jews begin to have also is part of the kind of socioeconomic conditions of Jewish institutions. And after World War II, you have just this steady growth of funding into lots of different Jewish institutions. Um, the tax code is creating more incentive for money to go into those kinds of institutions, both through charitable tax law, and through, other ways that the government is outsourcing. So some of those kinds of social welfare state goods that I was describing, the state, again, there's such a kind of quiet form of socialism in this country, right? The state is not doing it openly or blatantly and saying, look, this is your government giving you this, right? But it's outsourcing resources to providers, to nonprofits. So that also grows Jewish institutions. So you have all of these different factors that are growing the asset base of Jewish institutions. And there's a kind of identity crisis of what these institutions are meant to do, right? So many of these Jewish institutions were started at a time when there were just present material needs that Jews were facing, right? As new immigrants were coming in, questions about vocational training, what to do to help orphans, to help families settle, all of these different things. After World War II, you have that kind of legacy of these institutions, but they're not pivoting to think about the material needs of other populations. And they are becoming more and more sort of focused on the needs of Jewish identity and what that even means, right? And that's happening at the same time that there becomes a kind of steady conversation after World War II, after the Holocaust, and then certainly by 67 and 73, with the kind of buildup of the military power of Israel, a sense that financial assets could be a form of Jewish survival and Jewish security. And that's not particularly new, right? We could look at this dynamic in lots of other historical periods, but it becomes sort of this sense that these institutions should grow and should hold capital because of the ways in which that would guarantee some sense of survival at a time when there's, obviously a lot of reflection on and grief about the loss of Jewish lives, the Holocaust, and a kind of sense that if these institutions can grow and can just hold wealth, that itself will be a form of survival. And so I think it accounts for, like, these kinds of historical dynamics account for the shape that Jewish institutions begin to take, and account for a kind of rigidity that they increasingly have. And something I've worked on in other research is thinking about the turn toward endowment, right? Jewish institutions had tended to be kind of more revolving door, where whatever funding would come in, they would think about priorities to send that funding out. And by the 70s and certainly into the 80s, there are more and more benefits that are being offered in this same economic moment of deregulation to Jewish institutions, to holding on to their assets. And that money already sort of being marked as being a good, both in American tax law, it's called an American public good, once the money is sort of put into a charitable housing, and in the more psychological sense, right? That, the growth and the sustainability of these institutions is somehow equivalent to the growth and the sustainability of the Jewish people. And the last piece that I think is important to kind of weave into this is that you then have these institutions that, as Dania said, like nobody elected Jonathan Greenblatt or the American Jewish Committee or any of these kinds of institutions, right? But they gain the ability to sort of speak on behalf of American Jews, in part because they can claim to kind of have the assets. And it doesn't actually matter how much money they have. Like the American Jewish Committee doesn't have a great deal of money, right? And even in the scheme of things, the ADL doesn't have a great deal of money. But if it has a sort of access to a few very, very wealthy Jewish people, right, who they can sort of claim as being the funders for these organizations, and given changes in eventually by 2010 in campaign finance law and all sorts of other ways that sort of political money works, these institutions can sort of exercise an outsized political power that is well beyond the dollar for dollar power that they actually have. So it's not a correct analysis to say that they're just sitting on, billions and billions of dollars. It's that whatever they have, they're able to kind of like transform into claiming more power than really by a kind of dollars and cents calculation they have. And that is something I think that I know we're going to get to the sort of like, what can we do? But actually an awareness that we don't have to concede that narrative, right? We don't have to cede the power that we have to the kind of illusion of the power of these different Jewish organizations if it doesn't feel like they're actually being responsive to what we think is important for Jewish communities and for non-Jewish communities.
Yeah, okay. I'm definitely going to swing back to you on that point in this next piece of what is actually the imaginary power. And what can we do around, just going to put a note on here, to not self-marginalize when there's actually a growing power that we have counter to that. But Dania, I actually want to go back to you. Some of the threads that you were pulling there, just keep using the metaphor, about both whiteness as an asset. I'd love if you could talk about a little bit about what that means in relation to what Lila was just talking about with the growth of these institutions. And then both of you just for a moment touched on how Zionism, and particularly Zionism after 67, came to intersect at this time too. So I'm wondering if you can get a little bit more into that.
Yeah. Sure, I'd love to. So to pick up on the thing that where Lila just ended about the power that these institutions claim and the basis on which they claim it. Fundamental to that is this idea of exclusion. And, plied in with this red thread is this continual question about exclusion and inclusion. And so we talked earlier about like how exclusion is fundamental to the economy and to maintaining your assets, especially when most Americans' wealth is bound up in their home, and we need our property values to increase in order to retire or whatever. I want to talk about two ways that Jewish institutions through the 70s into the 80s and now weaponize exclusion or use exclusion to define who is Jewish and who is not, as sort of like ways, maybe the symptoms of the disease, right? So the first is intermarriage. Jewish institutions, when I was a kid, Jewish institutions were obsessed with intermarriage. And of course, I am the proud daughter of intermarriage. So it was very present to us as Jews of color and as Jewish people. And it was not a thing just to say, like my grandparents, all of my grandparents, everybody was just really excited about the cross fertilization of our cultures. It did not exist in my family that like, oh, you're marrying outside the tribe. But it was everywhere around us in the culture in the 80s. And something that we don't often talk about when we start talking about the economy and suburbanization and assets is gender. And I just want to name that it's the 70s. It's the second wave feminism, which is led by a not insignificant number of extremely badass Jewish women. And this obsession with intermarriage is absolutely an obsession about controlling who women get to be with and sexual freedom and like all kinds of things about women's autonomy. And it's also about conserving assets. So if you've ever read a Regency romance or watched Bridgerton or read Thomas Piketty's Capitalist one in like enormous tome about capitalism, like then you know that part of the whole thing, right? Like if you watch Downton Abbey, right? Like all of those things are about keeping the money and the assets and the house inside a small group of people to conserve the wealth. And so when we think about intermarriage, we can also think about it as an obsession about not marrying your wealth out of the community. I'm not suggesting that that is the primary way that people experienced it, the only way to think about it, but I am saying that it's there. And it's there because of this pivot of moving from wages to assets. Also, just not going to move on from that, but like, also it was really racist, and being really racist was part of the culture that was being instilled in the post, like once white Jews became white, then being really racist was part of being white because Jews were prominent parts of the civil rights movement and for economic justice and the intersection of racial and economic justice, and breaking those cross-racial alliances and solidarity was fundamental to being able to move the project neoliberalism. So that's one thing I wanted to say. I also think it's not incidental that there were so many Me Too problems with the people who were some of the biggest proponents of these questions about race science and intermarriage and whatnot in our community. Just going to park that there. I think the other thing about the way Zionism and Zionist concerns kind of take off after 67 is so often associated with the war, but is not only about the war. Like the ideas of community continuity and the like insecurities about being white people in the suburbs, just like everybody else, animate these questions about intermarriage. They animate the questions about Zionism and our collective responsibility to build Israel. And it also, again, creates a focus away from what had been the focus of like helping people in the communities where we are in the United States, and different kinds of efforts for working class and cross-racial justice. So one thing I want to mention is that the historian Nell Painter, in her history of white people talks about how for white people having a home that's not the United States, but like Irish people have Ireland and, you know, Italian people have Italy, like having a homeland like that is actually part and parcel of being a white person in the United States. And so having Israel be a strong, and also there's a whole thing about gender and the idea of the Sabra that we don't have time to get into, but goes back to this question about gender and who is in charge of what and what does being in charge of stuff look like. And the thing that I want to say about that is, and then I'm going to stop talking, is that this is the moment when the ADL invents the new anti-Semitism. That's the point at the K, at the vertical line of the K, when we're about to diverge. I'm not saying anyone knew we were going to diverge, but left unregulated, when you start to take all the regulations and the guardrails off capitalism, it runs to monopoly. That's how the system functions. That's what happened in the Gilded Age, for example. And so when we redefined anti-Semitism as basically anti-Zionism in the 1970s, it took away all the language about the socialism of fools and understanding the economy in these structural ways and having language for that and having the language of blaming Jews for that now we don't have, right? And so those two things converge as incredibly useful ways to redirect communal attention. And finally, they subsidize an enormous amount of building stuff, the shul with the pool and all of that stuff, that is really pretty expensive and creates a class barrier inside American Jewish life. Belonging to a shul is expensive. And like, it doesn't have to be, but it is. And so that too is a class sort that really attaches white Jewish American identity to affluence and to the neoliberal project.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dania. I wanna take this and say, okay, so all of these things have now been exacerbated over decades. We're at this, I'm assuming that the K is like off the charts from where this original K was drafted. And as you're saying that, like, globally we're seeing in this increase of extraordinary wealth inequality, people looking for explanations, people not having the language of anti-Semitism to explain why actually just taking out a few people at the top and putting in a few other people at the top of the same system isn't going to change anything. There's all of this lack of analysis that we've lost in the meantime, or lack of analysis that's emerged in the meantime. So I think there is, and Lila, you were speaking about this a little bit, the sense of things have gotten so bad, and that people are actually looking for substantive structural change in a way that is different than 10 or 20 years ago. I think particularly in the US, we're seeing a lot more people who are actually up in arms around economic inequality in a way that was just really starting to be true 20 years ago for the masses that we're seeing now. And so I'd love to hear you all talk about what you're seeing that is hopeful, what you're seeing that has openings, and what we talked about at the beginning, that the arc of this is long and people got us into this mess and people will get us out of that. And so, as we are in this period of time where tectonic plates are shifting politically, and as we're seeing, they can go to the left or they can go to the right. That there's a way in which power is up for grabs, and there's a lot of opportunity at the same time that there's so much destruction. So I would love to hear ideas around what is ours to take on. What interventions are there? What seems possible? What are even the seeds of interventions that seem possible? And going back to this red thread, what alliances do we need to build to succeed? And that was a lot. So I would say take whatever direction of that to you feels the most hopeful. And I actually love to start this time with Dania and then go to Lila.
Um, I am so hopeful. I mean, everything's a hot mess, but now we can talk about building what we really need. Um, so to pick up from where I left off through that very large set of questions, I want to be super clear that American Jewish institutions are not wholly or responsible, like it's not American Jewish institutions are not responsible for the K-shaped economy. We're not Jews are not responsible for the economy, nor are we responsible for the social segregation or the form and politics of this government or the Israeli government. But what Jewish institutions are responsible for in this kind of sweep of history is supporting and normalizing and sanctifying these kinds of economic developments, celebrating them and encouraging us and reinforcing that we somehow are different than our neighbors. And this like artificial isolation that is such a characteristic of the American Jewish experience is like, it's not that old and it's totally made up and we can just stop with that, which is, I think, one of the things that Lila was talking about earlier. So I am very excited about the opportunities we have in this political moment. Obviously, it comes at incredible human cost. What has happened in Gaza is, I don't know, unspeakable, and obviously totally speakable. And I think that what we do have is this, the rightmost parts of those who purport to represent us as American Jews have gone so far towards the rest of the far right, or with the rest of the far right with whom they are aligned, that they are polarizing. They are pushing people towards us. And by us, I mean the left. So you really saw that. This is the subject of my last In These Times piece. You really saw that when, you know, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove and the Jewish majority, and then after Mamdani won the New York mayoral, Jonathan Greenblatt announced the Mamdani monitor. Like, we had an influx of people with whom I did not think I shared very many politics at all. And then like that set of events pushed a ton of people who had been kind of on the fence into the Mamdani camp. And so I think this kind of moment of which side are you on can be incredibly powerful and clarifying. And there are two other things that I'm super hopeful about. I feel like there is increasing recognition about the urgent spiritual need to democratize Judaism, that people want the spiritual sustenance that our tradition can offer, especially in times like these, and that it's increasingly accessible and it's clearly robust enough to exist outside of the Jewish institutional walls. So, and that's actually how Judaism's always been made, like Maimonides, right? And so I am excited about the work I'm doing with Rabbi Andy Kahn at the American Council for Judaism to do some democratizing Judaism. I'm super excited about the Jewish diaspora movement that I know that Rabbi Alyssa Wise is going to talk about towards the end of this series. I'm just really, really excited about what more openness on our end of the political spectrum can mean for the Judaism we can make. I'll close by quoting Audrey Sasson, who now leads JFREG after Dove. And she said to me that, like, campaigning in the New York City mayoral election, she said, campaigning gave us the opportunity to remake how our neighbors know us. She meant as Jews, right? And winning gives us the chance to remake how we Jews understand ourselves.
I love that. Thanks, Dania.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Oh, sorry, what?
No, go for it. Just hope, possibility, interventions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are two things I'm thinking about. One is that historians always talk about this thing called contingency, and kind of why I feel like history is hopeful. Um, because whatever big explanation you think of for something, like there were so many contingencies, there were so many different factors, so many things that had to kind of align that caused whatever happened to happen, and so many other things that were happening that we need to account for, right? And so, you know, Daniel, when you were talking about intermarriage and ideas of sort of property, um, I think that's not impossible. I think that's like a worthwhile, interesting analysis. And there's also so many other ways to think about what that panic was about, right? There's so many different contingencies. You mentioned second wave feminism. Think about ideas of reproductive politics at the time, 1973, Roe v. Wade. So there's so many contingencies in history, which is why it's interesting to study, I think, because there's always another way of framing what was going on. Um, and I think that that goes for the present and that goes for the future. Like these scripts are not written, the stories are not told. It can feel that way because it's such a crushing economic system that we're involved in, that we're subject to, and that we've created. But there's contingency in it. And there's so many places where it's possible that the narrative A is different and could be different. And part of kind of finding the points where you can make different choices is being able to actually like unpack what sometimes feels like a very tightly woven, kind of opaque system. And I think that it seems to me that there is a kind of craving, and I see it, in Jewish communities, certainly, as these big institutions are saying things, forget the leftmost Jews who, for a while, have maybe known that what's being said is not so cool, right? But people who are more in the center and who would have given to these institutions and their parents gave, and they didn't give it much thought, like being appalled by what some of these institutions are doing and feeling as if they need to differentiate themselves from them and learn about them. And I think, just a growing sense that knowledge is power and that it's important to educate ourselves about other ways that, Jewish communities can be created and set up. So I think about contingency as a source of hope. And then, kind of ironically, I suppose, I think of repression as a source of hope because what we're seeing now in the Jewish community, I'm sure some of you read about the General Assembly and, just the sort of desire to silence any kind of critical conversation about Israel, the desire to say if those conversations are going to happen, they have to happen quietly and just sort of like, inside these protected spaces. But there has to be the sort of party line. Like those are not the words of confident people. And the efforts to use the law and to use all of these other systems as agents of repression, um, I think those are the weapons of the weak. And I think that this sort of turn to law as if law is going to be the thing that saves Zionism from criticism, right? As if law is going to be the thing that makes, the next generation of Jews say what the grown-ups want them to say, the grown-ups, right? That is repression being used to mask incredible, incredible enfeeblement. And we, again, like, we don't have to believe that that's strength. We just don't. And I think that, there are ways in which more and more people who might have sort of just gone with the flow is sort of recognizing that this is not the future they want, and it's not the future that their children are interested in or their grandchildren are interested in, and that there is an incredible creative, exciting Jewish and alliance-based, coalition-based culture, community politics happening. And if they want to repress that, it's not going to work. There's just really very little indication that it's actually going to work. It might be painful, and I'm not trying to minimize the pain and the suffering that it's causing. It's horrific, but I don't think it's going to work.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Oh, Dania, were you going to say something there?
Well, I don't want, if we have questions, I don't want to mess with the questions.
No, build on that point, and then
Okay,
I'll
great.
yeah.
So, I wanted to say something else I'm really excited about, which Lila's last comment made me think of, which is, in the United States, we have kind of two Jewish traditions. We have the kind that you learn if you go to Hebrew school or belong to a synagogue. And then you have the kind that I'm from, and maybe some of the rest of you are from, which is what I like to call the Lador Vador of materialist analysis. My grandparents were lefties. My parents were lefties. I am a lefty. And that too is an American Jewish tradition. And in this moment, we finally have the opportunity to put these and the other American Jewish traditions that I know less well together and make something that belongs together. And that kind of syncretism that was happening in the United States before the second Red Scare, that was happening in Europe and in the Holy Land before the Holocaust. Those traditions have always been in conversation with one another, and they've all of them are informed by and made richer by our non-Jewish neighbors and interlocutors and thought partners, lovers and friends. And so like we have this amazing moment right now that I did not think 10 years ago we would have in my lifetime. And like, what are we going to do? Not take advantage of it? Like, that's crazy.
Okay, so building on that, the taking advantage, one of the questions that came in was like, okay, so we need more democracy, we need more wealth equality. What are some of the current projects, experiments, leaders, campaigns that you all are seeing right now that feel like there's a lot of movement there, there's a lot of possibility there. This is a direction for people who really want to counter the history that you've described for us, where people can really dig in.
Well, uh, I think anyone who wants to build democracy, well, I think one of the lessons of the American labor movement and the worker center movement and the worker democracy efforts that have come since the inception of the American labor movement is that in order to have a robust political democracy, we need democracy everywhere. So in the 50s, the unionists called it industrial democracy, but it does mean like you do need democracy in the workplace. Elizabeth Anderson talks about how the American workplace is among the most authoritarian on earth. And I think we really feel that when Lila talks about the Federation general meeting and the kinds of things that people said from the stage. And so our institutions should be democratic. Our neighbors' institutions should be democratic. You should participate in the participatory budgeting in your neighborhood and in your community. And you should, if there's a DSA, you should join the DSA. And if there's not a DSA, you should join, or if there is a DSA, you should join the Democratic Party. And like all of the stuff has to be made participatory in order to be truly democratic. And so those are the political options. There's also your local food co-op. There's also starting a workers co-op. There's all kinds of ways to build democracy into the structures of your life and into the structures of your institutions. And a good place to learn how that works is, depending on where you are, is the Democratic Socialists of America.
So I see hopeful things happen on campus all the time. And one of the questions I get that used to annoy me, and now I've decided it's my favorite question, is when people say, so how are things on campus? Right. And I just say they are so exciting. I mean, can you imagine students who could be consumed by their phones and by social media and by all the woes we know, of this attention grabbing economy, who are deciding to like show up and protest things, and who are deciding, despite the repression, that they're going to, stand and be human walls against potential deportations, and who are going to use their names and use their faces when they believe something is going on or the government is funding something that it shouldn't be. So I think that there is, again, like why the crackdown on campus? Well, part of it is because there's a real student movement. And there are international students. Why the crackdown on international students? Because this is not a movement that has nation state borders, right? Because people realize that we're in this together, that especially, climate crisis is all of ours, right? And so these students are mobilizing, and they're working together, and they're building a politics that is scary to people who have benefited from a different structure of power and who want to keep their power. And so I think that that's also, a place where there's all sorts, like there's just an incredible amount of energy, and it's kind of awesome to behold, actually.
Yeah, and in the encampments, at least the ones that I got to visit, there's all kinds of like amazing like when there were encampments, right? There were all these kinds of rules about like how to treat one another, how to share the work, how to resolve conflict. It was incredible society building, even like even amidst the repression that was clearly happening from the administrators. And I just think in that too are the fertile seeds of this kind of democratic participatory flourishing that I really believe is not too far away.
Yeah. What's it? From your lips to God's ears. So I want to also ask about so this question leads to kind of both like thousands of years of history, and also it's kind of like a post 9/11 era in US history, and further back as well, but those are two of the points that are kind of most key. There was a question about talked some of the ways in which racism, and specifically anti-Black racism, has built itself into these systems in, the large US, obviously, and then also in Jewish community. And there's a question about how Islamophobia has been built into this modern Jewish identity, and if at all into the financial structures, and how those elements are like impact what we're seeing now today. So Dania, do you want to take a stab at that question?
I want to talk about racism. I always want to talk about racism.
You know.
So I want to pick back up this thread of exclusion. After 9/11 in New York, people don't really remember, but in addition to the mobilization for war and for shopping, there was also this special registration program for men from a particular set of countries. It's sort of the precursor to Trump's Muslim ban in 2017. And thousands and thousands of our New York neighbors self-deported, like fled the country, afraid of the unconstitutional spying that the New York Police Department was doing in their mosques, the way in which the FBI was weaponizing their community members against them. And this idea that, in general, I think there's been quite a lot of academic work about kind of the war against Muslims or Arabs as kind of the replacement for having, once we no longer had a collective American enemy in the Soviet Union and the communists, it sort of gets replaced. especially after 9/11 with Muslims. And what I can say as a person who is brown and Jewish is that I have never been so scared as when I have been mistaken for Muslim in a Jewish space. And I think the intensity with which people patrol the borders of who is Jewish and what is Jewish, and the enmity with people they perceive to be Muslim or Palestinian, and then by extension politically in solidarity with Palestinians, is fundamental to baking into an idea of American Judaism, this exclusionary current that we've been talking about all along. And this is one of those things where we could just stop. And in fact, most people have stopped. In my experience, like that sort of post 9/11 intensity is not the same, because we have a critical mass of people who are in solidarity with immigrants and in solidarity with Palestinians, and are so clearly breaking the lie of the monolith of the American Jewish perspective. I'm not suggesting that we have solved racism. I am not suggesting that we have not solved racism, but I do think that the clarity by which we connect the expressions of racism as political, as about Israel-Palestine, as about who's American, as about a commitment to the American right wing, is making that particular form of bias and political bias noxious. And that's what I was trying to say earlier about then it was so Islamophobic in the last election cycle that people who I did not notice to be especially attuned to Islamophobia found it to be so noxious as and anti-democratic that they cannot be associated with it. And I think that that's progress. I'm going to not talk about anti-Black racism, and maybe Lila wants to talk about anti-Black racism or Islamophobia.
Well, actually, sure. And I was thinking about, there's a political theorist, legal thinker, Linda Bosniak, who writes about borders. And one of the things that she talks about is how the kind of practice of patrolling a border doesn't just take an exterior form, but it becomes internalized. So, different measures that we at times in American history have passed to limit the entrance of different immigrant groups are not just policies that happen at ports of entry, but they affect then the way that people who are part of those groups that are being excluded, or maybe resemble them, or maybe speak a language similar to theirs, but are within the polity or within the country, they start to experience that border form of exclusion. And I think that the insistence on border security in Israel, for all sorts of complicated, contingent historical reasons that actually I think bear analysis and can't just be easily encapsulated. But the certainty of the need for borders, and then also the need for the sort of expansion of those borders without the expansion of citizenship and rights for people who end up being within those borders. I think that has become a kind of internalized logic for American Jews as well. And that the sort of borders of Israel have become the logic of some of the borders of American Jewishness, even as there's a countervailing pressure also to depict Israel as a kind of liberal democracy and as a kind of emanation of American liberal democracy, again, with lots of complications and contingencies. And so it does seem to me that, especially at heightened moments of Israeli border security, that kind of language and mentality has also become heightened among American Jews. And it has made them tolerant of forms of exclusion that otherwise and in other guises they eschew. And it has made it seem as if it is the reason of the state. It is the, you know, necessary means of national security or national interest that, kind of usurp normal due process and normal law and order. Um, and I think this is a moment that we're in right now, where lots of these different institutions and leaders of the institutions, who I guess I just want to have some good faith, right? Who I believe, in many ways want to think of themselves as being inclusive and want to think of themselves as not being racist, um, are for reasons of the state that have become sort of internalized to reasons of Jewish identity, feel as if they have a pass for really abhorrent behavior. And they feel as if that is a way of safeguarding these territorial borders. And I don't mean to just sit in judgment of that. I mean, I think it's something that it's a dynamic that I can't divorce myself from necessarily either. But it seems worth understanding that in order to kind of think through why forms of racism, um, become very tolerable to communities, especially who people, feel as if, oh, shouldn't they know better, right? Shouldn't they understand that their own experiences with exclusion mean that they should be sensitive to it? But I think that this dynamic has something to do with a fairly, remarkable tolerance for intolerance right now.
Mhm. Right. As Dania's always remembering me, it turns out Jews are just like everybody else. So,
Can I say one thing about anti-Black racism? Um,
yeah.
I mean, one thing about this pivot in the 70s is that the economic growth and the American nationalism and the Cold War created opportunities that the civil rights movement and the Black leaders of the civil rights movement were genius strategists and took intense advantage of and leveraged in order to build towards Black freedom and freedom for everyone. And part of the neoliberal turn is about closing avenues for that. So, and then we have this sort of hangover. This is related to Lila's last point, like about how things should work. So we had, even when at the beginning of my career, people were talking about economic inclusion as a way to address the racial wealth gap or as a way to, address the disparity, the white and Black disparities in the country. And that already was false. The economy was already leaving people behind. And so what we get in this pivot is a change in what it means to be equal, from there's a baseline that everyone lives in dignity to what we have now, which is everyone has the equal opportunity to become a professional or become a hedge fund manager or become a rich person. And those are not the same thing. And so part of what's so exciting about this moment is that I really believe that the Palestine solidarity movement would not be nearly as robust if it had not been for the intensity of the solidarity of the uprisings in 2020. And so we build, as Americans, we always build on the cross-racial alliances that we are in because of Black leadership in the United States.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like building on that, I've heard lots of folks who are doing national organizing right now talk about how one of the best points of hope they have about making it through this period of the US without an actual full authoritarian takeover is because we actually have that muscle memory as a country, from the civil rights movement and from so many other liberation movements that have come after and since. I mean, really thinking about like since the 200-year fight to end slavery, that there's actually a history of civil action in this country that we can draw on and that we have collectively in us to be able to draw on in this moment, and that there's a lot of societies that don't have that. So there's a gratitude that we can carry with us and carry forward in that. We are just about at time. So first, I just want to say, Dania and Lila, thank you. There was literally an extraordinary amount of ground covered here today. And just really want to thank you for sharing all of this very thoughtful and intricate analysis with us. And thank you to JLF for holding these kinds of conversations, for making this kind of interplay available to us, so that we're actually connected and having these conversations together, and we're not just alone on our feeds trying to make sense of these moments, but that we can actually be sharing ideas and sharing our thoughts together, and want to continue this process. This is a series, as Jordan mentioned. So the next session is going to be on December 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's From Grief Towards Possibility. And that is going to be a beautiful conversation. So thank you again to everyone here for being in this conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to a lot of the questions. This was just, these answers are like so depthful that we really needed to spend time on them. But keep sending your questions to JLF, and just really looking forward to us being in this conversation together about how we move to a really different place collectively. So thanks, y'all.